Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for joining us today for our third Wellness Wednesday. If you've been following along with us, you would have heard our first two events, inshallah. My name is Huda. I'm reporting live from Columbia, Maryland. On behalf of Penny Appeal and IAR, we thank you for joining and welcome you to tonight's event. Inshallah, we'll be discussing a variety of exciting information. I don't want to spoil it, but up now, I'm going to introduce our co-hosts for tonight. We have Sister Amal and Sister Azlina, who will be hosting tonight's events, and our special guest, Dr. Hassan Balak. If without further ado, I would like to bring Sister Amal and Sister Azlina to the screen. Jazakallah khairan for co-hosting tonight's events, and inshallah, we hope that the viewers are able to benefit from tonight's event. And I want to remind everyone to please post your questions in the comment section, and inshallah, we'll try our best to answer to our fullest knowledge what we can, and we'll refer you to wherever we need to refer. If we cannot answer tonight's question, inshallah. Jazakallah khairan, and thank you so much.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to Wellness Wednesdays. Penny Appeal and Islamic Association of Raleigh's Health and Wellness team, we are collaborating to bring you Wellness Wednesdays every Wednesday during Ramadan, where we talk about mindfulness, spirituality, anxiety, coping mechanisms, and anything around mental health. So feel free to contribute your questions in the chats, and inshallah we will bring it up with our expert today. And we do have the opportunity to learn from a highly trained professional, inshallah. And we'll go ahead with the introduction.
All right. So, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We are excited to have with us Dr. Hassan Baloch. Dr. Hassan Baloch is a psychiatrist, board certified in adult and child and adolescent psychiatry. He has worked in various settings, including academic and private practice in Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. He has more than 10 years of experience working as a private provider, interacting with the North Carolina mental health system. He has broad expertise in treating all age groups and diagnostic categories, but has special interest and research background in the evaluation and treatment of pediatric bipolar disorder. He also enjoys teaching, and he has won teaching awards, and he teaches medical students, nurse practitioner students, and physician assistant students on a regular basis. With that, welcome, Dr. Hassan Baloch.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you for having me. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasul Kareem. I'm happy to be here.
We are excited to have you here with us. Jazakallah khair for being here. And we would like to start the questions about learning more about what you have encountered throughout this past pandemic year, as far as, people coming in, what is it that they have been, concerned about, what kind of issues they've been there. So we'd love to learn more about that.
Yeah. Well, it's been a fascinating year. I mean, everybody has been, unfortunately, nobody asked for this pandemic, and we are all forced to deal with it. And before this happened, of course, nobody would have ever even imagined something like this could happen. We used to hear about bird flu, and everybody would laugh at bird flu. That's people are just trying to scare us. And now we've been stuck inside our house for now going the second year. Now we're in the second year. So, and it has brought to mind for all of us, like what would be the impact of this on people, and so certainly we've seen it on ourselves and our families. I work in a hospital setting, so I tend to see people who are, severely, going through severe distress, coming to the point that they have to come to a hospital. So you have to take that into account to some extent, what I'm seeing. But So what I've seen, and certainly my patient group is the folks who have more severe mental illness, and what they're dealing with is just the collapse of all of the systems that were in place to help them before. And so, for example, we had patients with schizophrenia who used to go to day treatment programs, which were shut down because you can't have it because of COVID. So now they're at home with families, and families are overwhelmed with how to handle them. And the same thing is true for every age group, really. I just saw last week a parent brought in one child, a 6-year-old, who was, has severe developmental disabilities, very hyperactive, causing all sorts of disruption in the house. But this mom is dealing with 4 other children with almost similar problems as well. And with no resources at all about where else she can keep them, to send them for professionals to help her. So, and many of these are young kids that they wouldn't qualify necessarily for daycare, or they've been tried in daycare and been kicked out, things like that. So, so I think I'm seeing a whole host of things, but I tend to see the problems, and I'm sure there are many examples of people doing well and coping and dealing with this pandemic in a positive fashion. But, the things that I've been seeing are where the system has collapsed that was supposed to help these folks, and trying to reconstruct that system on the fly, And so virtual experience is not always the same as a in-person experience. Sorry, I think you're muted, Sister Osman.
Yeah. Oops, sorry. Yeah, so it sounds like you've been seeing a lot of people coming in who usually have a place to go in the system, right? And because the things have been closed and services that they usually go to are not available anymore, so you're seeing them in places like your practice. Would you say that also for other families, such as those with special needs and those who are, where there's abuse, are you finding people also coming to your practices?
Yeah, so I think that was the Fauci and the central government. Federal government was one of their first things that they wanted to open back up, which was also what the American Academy of Pediatrics and all the child and adolescent specialists was, open back schools up for the kids with developmental disabilities, because they're losing all the gains that they made, which their parents struggled for years, and then because of this pandemic and they're at home, they're cut off the access to all those really needed professionals, the occupational therapists, speech therapists, educational specialists, and so I've seen it in a number of cases where parents are saying we struggled so hard to get our child up to this learning level. And now, without all those resources in the past year, they went back to 2 grades or something like that. And so I think it was critical to open schools back up for those kinds of kids first off, and because they really need that. They can't survive and learn in a home setting. There's no parent who can substitute for all of these professionals. So I think those are the ones for sure have been the most affected. And I think other kids have been affected in different ways. So some kids maybe even liked being at home versus going to school. So.
Yeah, and that's great to notice the difference between homeschooling and being in person as well, and the impact that can have on mental health. I'm curious about some coping mechanisms that people can use to support themselves in terms of, whether they are, especially for kids, for students who are doing more virtual work, and parents are scared to send them out because they just want to make sure that they are protected. They don't want to send them out. So what would be some coping mechanisms to support them to make the most out of those kind of settings there?
Yeah, well, I think one thing is that, before this pandemic, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, we had all these, very nice recommendations for parents about how much screen time kids should have. And pretty much those are blown out of the water, right? I mean, everybody's on the screen all the time. So the idea of, limiting somebody's screen time is no longer a feasible solution to anything. And so, but it does still hold, some value in the sense that, if kids are out on the screen all the time, in their room all the time, I have a teenager. My wife says, we haven't seen her all day long. She's in that room. She hasn't been out of that room. And that's the reality of parents and children these days. They're in attached to that screen, especially when it was all virtual. And there's an interesting statistic in the past that when American kids would go for summer vacation and come back for school, they would always invariably gain weight. Their health would be much worse, because they're sitting around during the summer and doing much more sedentary activities. And traditionally, school would have some form of exercise, right? There would be PE, there'd be some activities. You wouldn't be sitting around snacking all day long. You'd be, have to go and do work, So I think you have to, as a parent, sort of try to help recreate some structure for these kids, and then also, do something that school was doing, like, for example, have family outings for exercise. So even if you didn't do it before, now is a time to implement it. And, I think you still need to have screen downtime. So, you have to shut that computer off at some point, and let's go outside. Now the weather's better, you can definitely enjoy that. But yeah, I mean, that's been the biggest challenge, is like, where do you cut off technology, and how do you even do it in a feasible fashion?
Yeah, that's a very good point, because like you said, everyone is reliant now on it, and that's our source of social support for a lot of our kids. And is there anything that you would recommend, because we're trying also to weigh the balance of is it safe to go back to school? And some schools have opened, some are hybrid, and some are fully open. And there are families that are still concerned about that. And yes, they do want that social aspect of their child being able to go back, but they also don't want to risk their health, obviously. What's your opinion on that, and how do they make the right decision for their family?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's an individual child decision. So you have to look at the child and their characteristics, what their needs are, and whether they're being met or not at home or versus at school. And now, if they have certain characteristics and personality and capabilities that they could do well in either setting, then you have a choice. But a lot of kids are not at that level. They need, you pretty much, the parents realize these kids are goofing off in their room all day long, and it's hard for us to manage, because we're also working from home and on our computer screens, many times, and so who's going to watch after them? And so I think it depends, your child, and you can tell, like, my child is not doing well in this setting, they need to go back to a school setting. Now, we did have reduction in the social distancing requirements, for example, for schools. It's only 3 feet rather than 6 feet. So, and part of the reasoning behind that was, number one, they're not a high risk category for COVID. So that was one thought. And then secondly, it was just impractical to sort of implement a 6 feet distance in a classroom and constantly. And so it wasn't even a practically possible in a, if you think about a high school, traditional high school or middle school, elementary school, how easy it is or hard is it to keep these kids 6 feet apart. So 3 feet seemed more reasonable. And so that's what the most of the professionals have recommended. But so I think that's, like I said, first of all, it's definitely an individual child decision, and you have to look at the child. And like I said, some kids are really self-starters, and they found themselves to be more productive at home, and they love it. So in that case, you can, if they're doing well, you might as well finish up the year as they started it. But in other cases, I think, like I said, people, especially people with, like, for example, IEPs, individualized education program, where you have, specific assistance you get in the classroom, or then I think those kids, you definitely should go back as soon as possible. And I think it is safe to go back. Certainly now that most folks have the vaccine available to them, and many of them have taken advantage of it, that certainly made things a lot safer. So.
Yeah, and I'm curious, would like to go back a little bit to something we discussed earlier in terms of the relationship between parents and their kids when it comes to this, dynamic where everybody's at home and there is all this stress. So how are parents coping with all this added anxiety and all this added, pressure that they have from having either to take care of their kids or whatever is coming up for them in that space? Anything that you have observed or have recommended or would simply suggest that they would do?
Yeah, I think number one, parents should feel somewhat free to now set back up their kids together with going out and setting up play dates and setting up outdoor activities and sending kids out, especially now that outdoors is much more feasible. So that, I think my daughter does Girl Scouts, and other kids do other kinds of outdoor activities, and some of the kids have had, like, get-togethers with their friends outdoors in the patio or some outdoor setting. And I think that's important for them to have their own space, and for parents to get, some time where they're, free from the kids also, and also, now that families have been able to get vaccines, you can have them spend more time, if you have an extended family, grandparents and so forth, and get back to in-person socialization. I think we shouldn't be as afraid as we were in the beginning. We know much more about the disease now, and we have much more protection from it as well. We have many people vaccinated. So I think, the definitely for parents, it would be a big relief and for kids, they would, I feel bad for the younger kids who learn so much from socialization and seeing other kids, that they're missing out on these critical times when they could be, there's only so much a parent can fill in as a play buddy for somebody who's younger, and they really need their same age kids to interact with. So I think the more we can set up these kinds of activities, the better. I think obviously the IAR has done many such things, and then the Al-Iman School, if people are affiliated with that, our full-time school here does a lot of external activities as well. And then the youth groups are active, so they are meeting. And so I think whatever venue or opportunity you have, get your kids back in these activities, because I think being at home I think we did it long enough. Now they need to get back and start meeting their friends and getting out there. Yeah. So, sorry, did you, there's a questions in the private chat. I can't remember how we said we were going to handle these.
Yeah, no, it's fine. So we have some questions that came up, I guess, from participants here, from viewers. And they're looking for understanding how long should you wait if you got your regular immunization shot to get your COVID vaccine for kids who are 16 years old?
Okay, well, I'm not sure I understand the question. The kids at 16 are eligible now. The studies, they did the same sort of evidence of studies that they did for the adults, they did with the kids 16 and older. And in fact, right now they're on that, currently Pfizer is studying 6 and above. So hopefully we'll get some data from that as well. So I think for 16 years and above, I think as soon as you can get it, you should definitely take advantage of it. I saw recently, there was a story today about a family that went on a trip to Hawaii, and they were all vaccinated, but the kids weren't vaccinated, and one of their children did have some underlying health conditions and ended up contracting COVID, and unfortunately passed away in Hawaii. And so I think if you're going to take, as we say, take the asbab, take the tools that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, and so some people ask, obviously, like I'm going to rely on Allah, but of course in Islam we know that Allah gave us all these tools, so we are meant to take advantage of them. And we know specifically that we're supposed to be active in avoiding plagues, as we know from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and then also the companions, and to take medicine when we can find it. So as far as when you can take it, I don't actually know the answer to that question. I'm not an infectious disease doctor, so as far as like if you test positive, how long you'd have to wait, I imagine it takes 2 weeks for you to be symptom-free to get out of quarantine. So I would imagine at least 2 weeks. Well, actually, it should say 10 days is the current timeline. So I would imagine they would want you to wait at least 2 weeks after you've tested positive and been symptom-free. So if you no longer have any symptoms, then and for at least 2 weeks, I would say then it would be a reasonable time frame for you if you wanted to get a vaccine. But you should have some degree of immunity, I would think, for several weeks. So I don't think it's an urgent thing you have to do right away. But if you're looking to get it for some reason, like some people need it for increasingly for travel, some places might require it, I would say wait at least 2 weeks after you're symptom-free to do it. But a child got his normal vaccine shot. This is a good question as well. I don't actually know the answer to that one, since I'm not a pediatrician. I don't know if there's some guidance about the different shots, because also the shots are all different as well. So the Pfizer and Moderna are the mRNA vaccine, and the other ones are actually deactivated adenovirus, I think. So I don't know if there's some interaction between those and the normal vaccine shot. I would imagine you wouldn't want too many vaccines all at once, and you wouldn't know what you're reacting to if you have a bad reaction. So, I would think you would want to wait to get that until you're sure you've overcome or dealt with all the reactions from the previous vaccine. I think, like I said, 2 to 3 weeks, you should have had your normal immune response and your body should be back to its usual self. So I imagine you can get any vaccine then, but I would check with your pediatrician. I don't know the exact answer to that question.
Yeah, absolutely. Just make sure you check with your healthcare provider for those responses. That's for sure. So I'm actually curious about the bipolar, people who have bipolar, and how they are coping in this specific, pandemic time. Have you seen any increased symptoms, or is it any better? Is it any worse for them? Just curious about, for bipolar, how that's going for them.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know about specifically for patients with bipolar disorder. I know in general for all patients with sort of serious mental illness, like I said, they had reduced access to services. And although, you can see your therapist virtually, what that has meant for some folks is that if they don't have a current provider, it's been harder to get one because everybody can access services, so everybody's overwhelmed. So I thought initially when I was thinking, people are seeing people virtually, it'd be much easier to get in. But I think now when I'm getting feedback from patients is that it's hard to find somebody who is accepting patients because they're so busy. When they used to have some openings when people wouldn't show up, now much more they're filling them with virtual visits and less likely, and their hours may be lower as well. So I think that's number one. The biggest thing is about access, and about the services that you can get. But the ones that do have already a provider, I think they've been much easier to follow up with their provider because, like I said, they can use their phone and still go to a session. And so there's really a lot less barriers to seeing the provider. By and large, it's an interesting point. We were thinking about whether mental health was worse in the pandemic or was it better, and that's a question. And so I've looked at that extensively because I've done several of these talks now, and I've been looking all through the literature and following it over the last few months. And frankly, it's a bit quite mixed bag. The mixed. Initially, there were some studies that showed really severe sort of negative outcomes for mental health and with the pandemic, especially in young people. But then, later on, we've had some other studies that show, reduced rates of suicide and severe mental health outcomes. So, I think you can certainly construct a case both ways around. So, like, for example, you can construct a case in your mind about why there would be less mental health problems, because people are more connected with their families, they're more at home, they're less stressed out, there are less parties and activities where people might be using substances, for example, so that can be a negative sort of stimulus for their mental health to deteriorate. There was more money available in some ways because they had 2 stimulus checks and things, and so some people were able to access that. They had many people got unemployment for longer periods of time, so that was another sort of safety measure that the government put in place. So and then being together as a family, sometimes it forced people to stay together longer and having to take care of their loved ones. So that can be additional stressor, but it also can improve outcomes, because we know for example, in schizophrenia, it's well known that many of the third world countries that are less developed have better schizophrenia outcomes. And it's always been a puzzle. And one of the reasons why they thought about it is because they have more cohesive family unit that is able to provide the support for that person. And whereas, in America, there's less, or in many modern developed worlds, the family structure is not as like as a support. You might have much lower numbers in your family, and much less likely to have family support. So I think it's a mixed bag. Like I said, there are some people who clearly they needed these sort of enhanced services, we call them in the Medicaid system here, and that those services were not available, and they've done worse, and we're having to deal with them in the hospital. We keep them inpatient here much longer, and they come back more frequently. But then others, like I said, they've had more support. So and I think on balance, we'll see. We're still open question.
Thank you for bringing those up, Dr. Baloch. I think it's been really hard for some people, and yet for others, it's actually been better for their mental health. Like, for example, those with social anxiety, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if there are those who have social anxiety and who don't like being on Zoom because they feel like they're always in the spotlight, right? So it's not very clear right now what the effects of the pandemic are to our mental health. So
well, yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the social anxiety piece, because I have kids that I've seen that they never turn their camera on, for example. They don't want to be seen, and they're self-conscious, and they were self-conscious when they were at school in person, and then they've still kept that same sort of attitude. So I always say with anxiety, part of the problem is you avoid the thing you're anxious about, and it just becomes worse. So I am curious to see, although they're feeling better, being less socially anxious, being less stimulated by being in social settings. I agree, and many of those kids are like being at home. I wonder, once we're in a different spot where we have to really go back into a physical environment, and whether they're going to be much worse off, or if this was some critical period where they were able to get the benefit of being in a less stress environment, and maybe they'll have better resources when they're older to handle that situation. I wonder. That is is a question I have about these kids. Yeah.
Yeah, I have one of my children has social anxiety, and he tends to turn his camera off, but then at the prodding of the teacher, he would slowly, lower, turn it on and then lower so you can see the top of his head, and then later on you would see his forehead, and then you would see his eyes. So he's reached the point at this time of the school year where you can see his eyes, but not the
okay.
whole.
Wow. Yeah, that's an interesting. Yeah, you can see the progress.
So I had a question on incidents of death by suicide that have been happening, and some have been in the Muslim community, that have been quite well publicized, and I'm sure you've heard
Yes.
recently. So a question that I have around that is, what are some of the red flags, for our viewers, family members or friends, that you would advise us to look out for?
Yeah, so 90% of teen suicides, when you look back, they could have been diagnosed with a mental disorder. So that's not true for every category of every age of suicide, for example. But definitely in young people, most of the folks, 90%, had some sort of mental health problem that was existing. And so I think the number one thing is pay attention to your children, and if they're struggling emotionally, don't ignore it. I think that's the most important thing. And as far as risk factors, a lot of them are really sort of statistical risk factors. They're related to family history of suicide. They're related to family history of mental illness. They're related to stress in the family environment. For example, parents who are arguing a lot or going through some serious struggles financially and things like that. But the number one there's some changeable risk factors. So, for example, we know that the most successful form of suicide, even in young people, is still firearms. And so firearms or suffocation. So it's kind of back and forth. But the firearms, whether they're locked up or not, statistically have an increased rate of teen suicide. So it doesn't matter if they've been secured or if they're unlocked or open. Studies show that that's an increased risk. So I think if you're first of all, pay attention to your child and understand and appreciate if they have a mental health issue. And secondly, if they do have a mental health issue, if you do have certain of these modifiable risk factors, see if you can modify them. I think you don't necessarily need to have a firearm in most cases, unless you're working for the police or something like that. But or military. But I mean, there's certain instances where you need to. But I think most folks, they could, if they're having somebody struggling with that, because parents often overestimate their security of these things. They think, oh, they don't know how to access this, or they don't know this. And meanwhile, kids are sort of like prisoners in a prison. They're watching you all the time. They're watching all the patterns of the guards as they come back and forth, and they've memorized everything, and they know every nook and cranny of the house, and much more than you give credit for. And I know myself, I was. I got into my dad's firearm at one point, and it wasn't loaded or anything, but I mean, he didn't want me to access it. I just was curious around the house. I found it, and so I think that's part of people don't expect from their kids. But serious signs of mental illness are the same. I mean, their withdrawal, social withdrawal, a change in their normal their pattern of behavior in terms of their interests and activities. They could have increased sleep patterns. Teenagers is a little difficult. Sometimes you're hard pressed to know, but sleeping excessively or all the time, or not taking care of themselves. Whether it's from physical perspective, stop taking care of their hygiene, and I think it's important that their friends. So if you can, because friends. I've often said friends can be the ones that sometimes step in when the parents don't know. For example, many of our people come to the hospital, their friends called their parents. They said, hey, this person's texting me suicidal comments and this or that, and I think this person needs some help. And the parents never had any clue about it, So it's so knowing the friends, both from understanding what is the impact of the friends on your child, but also because you want to have some kind of open communication. So if they do have concerns, they can reach out to you. I think that's important as well. So yeah, I mean, it's a challenge, especially for older kids that are not communicating with you as well, which is naturally in the teenage years, but they'll be more interested in talking with their friends. So, if you know their friends, it's a good thing to do.
Yeah, good point, because some teenagers aren't very comfortable going to their parents with their problems, right?
Yeah.
So keeping that in mind and being aware of changes in their behavior is always good. And also, I think changes in their weight or appetite and sleep habits are always
energy level, school performance. They were a straight A student. Now they're barely passing. They stopped logging in on Zoom. Teachers are calling. They're not attending classes. I think the biggest thing is change. Because your child. If there's a marked change, then it should be appreciated. Now that means paying attention to your child, and so obviously many of the kids that just statistically in terms of what happens is that they are in an environment where the parents are stressed out by other things, so they're hardly paying attention of their children as well. So they're whether it's because they're single parents, they can hardly juggle everything, and so they have a lot more free time or whether they have their own financial or relationship stress or health problems. So I think that inevitably that's a common thread in most of these cases, is that somehow the parents became overwhelmed with other things, and eventually that also led to lack of attention to certain warning signs that were obvious in the kids otherwise. And one more thing I just want to mention. I mean, sometimes parents are aware and they're seeing these warning signs, but they just don't know how to get help or assistance. I think that's another thing, and they kind of throw their hands up. Now, number one, if they're seriously in sort of a life-threatening situation, you can always bring them to the hospital, right? I mean, we have mental health professionals at every hospital, and they can help you get access to treatment. And we are in this is from a North Carolina perspective, so anybody's listening from other states, it wouldn't necessarily apply, but in North Carolina at least, it's fairly easy to get mental health services if you don't have insurance or if you have Medicaid. It's in Wake County and Durham, Johnston, and Cumberland County, you call this company called Alliance Healthcare, and Alliance has a 1-800 number 24/7, so they can get you connected to any mental health treatment you need for child or adult. And like I said, it's for the specific category of people who have no insurance or are Medicaid. So I think you can get services for those populations, at least in North Carolina, fairly easily. But those are two just ways to address it. Oh, by the way, also there's a crisis center in Wake County called UNC Wakebrook. You guys may or may not be aware of it, but in terms of the parents listening, but it's over near Wake Medical Center. It's on the backside of there on Sunnybrook Road, and they do crisis assessments any time. And then obviously Holly Hill Hospital, which is also right back there behind Wake Medical Center, has a crisis walk-in as well. So
those are great resources, Jazakallah khair, Dr. Blanch.
Yeah. Two other things I forgot I mentioned. There are behavioral health urgent cares now, and there are two that are operated in. One is in Durham, one is in Wake County. The Wake County one is Monarch, I believe. It may be in Wake, I'm not sure, but it's in the Alliance catchment area. And then the one in Durham is Carolina Outreach. They operate that. So they're similar to regular urgent care, And so one of the benefits is that it's not as costly. So, if you have no insurance or Medicaid, you just go and walk in, and the time is normally less as well. So.
Yeah, these are some great resources that you have shared, and I'm sure that the parents watching would be interested in those as well. And with all this that's going on, from a mental health perspective, I'm sure that comes with an emotional toll on people as well. Just curious as to, from an emotional perspective, if you could speak to what might be coming up from that, and what would be some positive way of directing all these, negative emotions that may be popping up in the space in a way that can be channeled to provide them with more of positive outlook and get them to let go of those negative thoughts that may be, sending them towards the not appropriate way of, directing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. Now, when I was getting into psychiatry, and my father, he told me, because I was interested in a lot of religious things as well. He's like, religion and psychiatry, they're not the same. You have to check. They're not. There's no overlap. But he was right and wrong. Increasingly, I think we have certainly there's psychiatry, its own discipline. There's nothing necessarily to do with religion, but what we found out over mental health over the years, and if you look at traditionally, who were the doctors of mental health back in the 1200s? They were definitely the religious people. They were the ones who you would go to if you had a crisis of depression or anxiety, and they would give you a prescription. Prescription of some kind of mental health direction, and many times you see the books of spiritual practitioners. They're all about how do we conceptualize our problems. There's a very famous book, Kitab al-Hikam, which is Ibn Ata'Allah, a famous book on wisdoms, and all of them are basically about your mentality, how you're approaching a matter, and how you're upside down in your approaches. I think one of his ones I remember, he said, actually, let me pull that up. I have it on this thing here. He says, you're striving for what already has been guaranteed to you, and your remissness in what has been demanded of you are signs of blurring of your intellect. And so it was just sort of a meaning we strive for things, our rizq, which is already ordained, and then we leave aside the things that the worship acts that has been that we don't know about, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked us to do. And so he's like, look at how our intellect is upside down in how we pursue things. So many of these things, they looked at how do we correct our understanding about how we view life itself. And I think I like to talk about that in terms of therapy, because what many people don't realize is that what is therapy? Because obviously, if you haven't been in therapy, you think it's sitting around on a couch or something that you saw in a movie. But in fact, much of therapy now is really just like that. It's cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's about addressing some of these thought patterns that you've developed. Whether you're thinking, you're overly self-critical, to the point of blaming yourself incessantly to where it's becoming to make you depressed. Or you're calling yourself names that you would never call anybody else. Or you're blaming yourself. Or you're seeing everything through a negative lens, all or none thinking, as we call it in CBT. And so working with a professional is really about addressing these negative thought patterns that you've gotten into, and it's really more problem based. So I think first of all, we're in the month of Ramadan, so. We can obviously, we're asked to, if we have a difficulty, and so you have to seek help through patience and prayer. And so first of all, that's such an awesome sort of tool that we have in our toolbox as Muslims. And then we obviously have the Quran, because the Quran, it talks about so many of these topics of anxiety and depression, because we see the Prophet ﷺ, it's addressing him first of all before it addresses any of us, and we know that he went through all of these struggles and turmoil, and many times severe depression, as we see Surah Duha, is addressing the Prophet ﷺ when he had a long gap in transmission of the revelation to him, where he felt like he had been abandoned, you know, and you can see that in the text of Surah Duha, is trying to comfort him, the Prophet ﷺ. And so, you know, so when we read the Quran, we can look at that and we can reflect on all the stressors that other people have been through, and how they managed and how they changed their minds and how they looked at their topic. And we have the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, which is in Ibn Majah, where he said that don't say about if you've had a musibah, that say, I wish I had done so and so, you know, but instead say that this is a qadr of Allah, that this is Allah's taqdeer, and he does whatever he wishes. And whoever does the opposite, who dwells too much, in other words, on saying that it's, I wish I had done so and so, then in fact he's opening the door for shaitan. And I look at that all the time because, you know, American society, for example, has some very positive elements in the fact that whenever there's a disaster, there's an analysis and trying to improve on whatever the problem was. But on an individual level, when you do that excessively, which is what this hadith is talking about, and you keep blaming yourself, I wish I had done so and so, it becomes, in fact, a door for shaitan to enter, and it's a door for excess anxiety and depression. And in fact, ultimately, you know, we have to rely on the fact that what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, many of these things are part of His qadr, and we don't have control over everything. And we don't have really control over anything almost, you know, but we have to live our lives like we have some control, right? But probably many things are kind of an illusion. But so we talked about, I think people talk about active coping. So I always say patience can be an active thing. As we were asked to seek comfort in patience and sabr, you know, the Quran talks about patience more than 70 times in different ways, in just different forms. And the reason why it's so much emphasized is that patience, when you do it in a conscious way, where you think about, you know, why are you patient? Because of the qadr of Allah, because you're hoping for His reward, because you know that other people have been trialed with similar or worse trials, and that we're patient when we are facing musibah, a difficulty, we're getting a reward in our patience. And so it's an active process because you're thinking through all these things. And so it's not just a passive thing. So that's another form of active problem solving. So, you know, I think there's a great scope of that. And in fact, now we have there's new research on this kind of combination of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and spiritual components. There's a spiritual CBT that people are kind of examining. Basically, understanding that what the old spiritual practitioners of Islam and in other religions did was they were basically doing therapy. You know, but we didn't call it that at that time. Yeah.
Thank you, Jazakallah khair, for that reminder. MashaAllah, we do have the benefit of Islamic history, where we have had some of the earliest mental health facilities have been in the Muslim world, MashaAllah. I do have a question that was submitted by a parent. She says that my son is on the autism spectrum, and he has completely been doing virtual schooling since the pandemic started. He's 7 years old, and he's enjoying the comfort of home with less stress of rushing around, going to school, and extra stimulation at school, etc. But I'm concerned about his emotional and social skills in a broader settings. How can I help him?
Yeah, well, you know, that's an interesting question in autism and whether or not social skills. So there is something called social skills group. You know, first of all, autism, I don't know if everybody knows what that is as audience, but it's basically a developmental disorder, and it can have a wide spectrum of severity. So the most severe kids with autism, they're nonverbal. They're not even speaking. And then the other ones that are less severe, they may be having more social difficulties in terms of maybe being socially awkward or not understanding social cues that other people would understand naturally, like, you know, like certain idioms or certain phrases or certain jokes they don't necessarily get. And so that's sort of a more minor form of autism. But it's definitely a communication deficit is one part of it, a socialization impairment. And then there's what we call stereotypic behavior, where you do certain repeated things like hand flapping and spinning and things like this. But so the problem with autism, of course, is that it's so wide in the spectrum of severity. So I don't know how severe your child's condition is, so I wouldn't know necessarily exactly how to answer that. But I will say that we've studied social skills groups for autism for many years, and it's still an open question whether they actually are beneficial or not. What social skills do with groups do with kids with autism is that they teach them rules. So if you shake, if you meet somebody, you shake their hand and you look them in the eye, and so that's like a specific rule. Because kids with autism, some of them can do very good with certain rules. If you give them rules, they don't naturally understand the social implications. But if you give them a rule, then they'll understand. Oh, if somebody gives you something, you say thank you, and then so they'll do that as a rote. They memorized it, so now they know what to do. Whereas they would otherwise may not have needed to know that. So I don't know that they'll be necessarily impacted negatively by the lack of socialization, but there's inevitably some knowledge that is gained through socialization. So, to what extent that lack of socialization is going to impact your child is an open question. But I'm sure there's some negative impact because, like I said, you learn some things naturally. The kids with autism don't learn as well, but they do pick up some things here and there. So, I think this is a good question for the health and wellness team, maybe, in terms of what resources we can give for parents with developmental disabilities. I think there could be a good opportunity for them to have groups, maybe meet up and for sure that is part of NAMI. NAMI does have that, and the Autism Society of North Carolina does have that, where they have groups for kids and parents to get together. I don't know if they're operating all right now because of COVID, but it's a good opportunity to have support from other parents who are going through same challenges, and for the kids to have some up.
I'm happy to say that, mashallah, the IAR health team, we actually do have a special needs group. And so we do have a group of moms of children with special needs, and we do keep in touch with each other and share resources. And also, I wanted to remind our audience who are in Raleigh that IAR offers actually a special services in person. So if you wanted to go for Tarawih, you could sign up to use a special room if you have a child with special needs. So we are certified by Muslim for anyone, not just children, but any people with special needs. And so we do offer a khutbah every year with sign language, and then we do have we do have a Sunday school also for children with special needs. So, mashallah, do check out the website, the Raleigh website, under special needs for our full services.
Okay. Yeah, I knew you guys were doing some good work. I just wanted to throw it out there because maybe everybody doesn't know about it.
Jazakallah.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair for sharing that beautiful, amazing wisdom that you have with us here today. And, especially what would be some practical final tips that you would give parents to support their kids? And what would also be some practical tips that you would provide the kids to do so they can have that balance between them and their parents? Because especially teenagers, and we all have teenagers, many of us do, and it's always a struggle trying to get them to be in a certain way if they are not interested in being in that for themselves. So curious for anything practical that you may be sharing in terms of what would be something simple that we as parents and them as kids can do.
Well, yeah, it's really about age specific, right? Because every age is a different challenge, you know, and so teenagers different from middle school, different from elementary school, different from preschool, you know. And I think if you're looking at teenagers in specific, you know, I believe this is hadith Amaru ala dini Khalili, is that the man is on the religion of his friend, and so this is the unfortunate problem is that teenagers, sometimes you can't choose their friends, but we can try to steer them in a direction of giving them opportunities for better friends. So I think, like I said, all of the groups are now meeting. I think all the halakas and the youth groups are back active, from what I know. And I think I would encourage every parent to get back involved. You know, I think we know more about this virus now than we did a year ago, and I think it's fairly safe. And if you can all get vaccinated, it'll be even safer. And so get for teenagers in particular, because they're at home on virtually connecting with God knows who, right? So you know you need to create opportunities of positive connectivity. You know, it's I always say to parents is, you know, just not enough to tell them what not to do. You have to create the positive encounters, you know, to outweigh any of the negatives. So create the opportunities for your kids to have positive role models and influences. So go back to what we're doing, and I think from a virtual perspective, you know, there's a lot of now like national halakas that are operating with like some of the famous people, scholars and things. And I think getting your kids involved in those are also helpful, because although they don't get these necessarily interactivity with other kids, they do get the intellectual stimulation, because you know they need some challenge to how they think, and also many times we're afraid to touch certain topics as parents because we're afraid you know that we'll open up a can of worms. But in many of these cases where you have some of these really good national halakas, I think Suhaib Webb has a good one, which my daughter really likes. They do address, you know, every hot button topic. So, you know, I think it does prove very useful for kids as they're trying to navigate intellectually as well as, you know, spiritually about this world and all the challenges that they have to deal with that we didn't have to deal with, you know, unfortunately for them. But so yeah, use all the tools you have, but I think getting back in person with positive influences and using the virtual tools that we have for halakas and things that are like this that are useful is what I would advise. Yeah.
Jazakallah khair. Ms. Leah, can I close this out?
Yeah, excellent advice. And our time is just about up for today. Jazakallah khair to Dr. Hassan Baloch, who has been giving us wonderful advice today, mashallah, around mental health. And inshallah, please join us again for our next Wellness Wednesday next week at 6 p.m. to join our new guest who will be giving us more information on mental health hot topics. And please join us and provide questions and comments. We'd love to know if this has been helpful and how we can improve going forward, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
وعليكم السلام. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك، نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت، نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.